Hi everyone, it's so good to see you. I'm looking forward to sharing with you from God's Word today. I'm really enjoying our current theme. But thanks for being here with us. Make yourself at home. I'm really grateful for online church and how it's brought us together and created that space for us to keep learning about God together. And thanks for the team that works so hard behind the screens making all this work for us. We're so grateful to you. Thanks Rob, thanks Joel, everyone else who just make it happen. It's so good. So today we are on to our next installment of God Is, where we together are seeking to understand God more. How do we fill in the gap, if you like? God is, what's your first or your default word? God is love, or God is faithful, like we looked at last week, or some of those bigger theological ideas. God is infinite, God is transcendent. I wonder how you're getting on this journey of trying to understand God more. Because it's so important, isn't it? We keep saying this, that how we, if you like, answer this question determines how we live our lives. And I, for one, want to live my life in such a way that I get every last drop of life out of life and give God glory in doing that. So that's my prayer for you too, that you'd continue to get to know him more and more. So today we are going to be tackling a fairly big one of these. Here we go, everyone. It is God is sovereign. Wow, what a concept, what an idea. If you've kind of been in the church world for a long time, or if you're a Christian, or perhaps even got some other kind of religious background, this is an idea that's often associated with God. And can you spot a word in there that sort of gives the game away, or maybe a part of this word that we're familiar with? Well, for me, it's the word reign. And straight away, that gets me thinking about a king or a queen. It makes me think about a throne and ruling and kingdoms. And I guess all that is packed into this word. And again, if you've been around church for a while, you'll be familiar with phrases that are speaking about the sovereignty of God. At some point, you'll have heard someone in their prayers refer to God as the Lord of Lords or the King of Kings, maybe even sung about it. You'll have heard people talk about God's kingdom. This is all referencing the sovereignty of God. One of the classics that people often like to declare is that God is still on the throne. That's a way of declaring that he's sovereign. I was once in a church in America, in Michigan, where it's always stuck in my mind the way the guy prayed, because he just kept saying, God, you're in control. So that's another idea, if you like, that is associated with the sovereignty of God. So it does mean that God is in charge of everything, that he is in control, that he is ruling, that things happen because of him. And there's this classic statement of faith, which I've used before. It's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. This was written in the 1600s just to help the church at large, define its beliefs. And it references and speaks about God's sovereignty with this statement. It says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. The sovereignty of God is an important part of our belief and has been right through the ages. And in the 1600s, they were trying to capture that to remind us that God of his own will, freely, unchangeably, he makes happen whatever's going to happen. That's what this is saying. It's saying he is sovereign. Another, if you like, classic person, if you can say that about a person, is Matthew Henry. And Matthew Henry wrote a very famous commentary on the Bible And for all I know, he could have written it on our street because he was from these parts. And there's an old chapel facade on our street that used to be part of Matthew Henry's chapel. And here's how he talks about the sovereignty of God in his commentary on Genesis chapter 1. He says, God is sovereign Lord of all by an incontestable right. If he is the creator, no doubt he is the owner and possessor of heaven and earth. That also sums it up. It links it into the fact that because God created everything, he's therefore the owner of everything. A bit like an artist, I guess. Paints a picture. It's their work of art. They're associated with what happens with that work of art. It's the same here. This is what Matthew Henry is alluding to. So we've had the Westminster Confession. We've had Matthew Henry. And here's my definition, everyone. He scores when he wants. That makes it nice and simple and easy for me to understand. God scores when he wants. And if this this might seem a bit alien to you, this is the line out of a classic football chant, a football song. I think it was first sung about Robin van Persie when he played for Arsenal. And the song is very simple. I won't sing it to you, but I'll recite it to you. It goes like this about Robin van Persie. He scores when he wants. He scores when he wants. Robin van Persie. He scores when he wants. That's it. You get what they're singing about. He's that good at scoring goals. It's up to him when he scores. And I just thought, when I was thinking about it, that summed up the sovereignty of God. God does what he wants, when he wants, because he can. He's the Robin van Persie of the God world, but that doesn't sound right at all. But this sentiment is expressed in the Psalms, believe it or not. And in Psalm 115, verse 3, it says, "But our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases." And yes, the sovereignty of God is a huge doctrine. There's a lot of theology behind it. And there's some big questions about it, which I'm going to allude to a bit later on. So, for example, what about human choice? What about free will? How, if God is in control of everything, how can people also have free choice themselves? Now, it's a big question. It's worth calling the question out. It's something that theologians have tried to work throughout the centuries. For me, I just settle on that God does whatever he pleases. He scores when he wants. And he somehow allows some freedom for us within that. It's very difficult. But maybe we'll allude to some of that a bit later. Okay, so I've got 3 things in true Tim fashion that I'd like us to consider that the sovereignty of God means for us. God is sovereign. God does whatever he pleases because he can. What are some of the things we can garner from that? And they're all about life. Here's the first one. Life is spiritual. Okay, here's the verse, Psalm 103, verse 19. "The Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all." Now there's one translation that says, "The Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his sovereignty rules over all." All of life is spiritual. I wonder if you've ever considered that before. We often like to compartmentalize everything into different aspects of life. We do it all the time. This is my work life. This is my family life. This is my church life. We often do that about ourselves. This is my physical life. This is my emotional life. This is my spiritual life. But I've just been thinking along the lines that if all this is made by God, and if, like the verse says, that God is looking after all this from his place in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all, then just perhaps more of this is spiritual and has spiritual connotations and connections and significance than we've thought before. I think about the story of Jacob when he was, I think he was fleeing from his, or was it his uncle? Or around that story anyway, and we read that he went to sleep in the wilderness and put his, had a rock for a pillow and had a dream, Jacob's ladder. And this dream showed a picture of a ladder that extended from earth to heaven, and there were angels descending it and ascending it. Kind of just showing there is a link, a strong link between all this around us and heaven. There is a spiritual world that is completely alive, and sometimes we should do better opening our eyes to it. It's because God is sovereign. I believe there's more to life as a spiritual experience because he's the artist. We're his works of art. We are intrinsically linked to the Creator, sovereign Creator, who's having his will and say in the world today. Life is spiritual. Try not to compartmentalize it too much. Maybe look out for more of God in the world. I often joke about it. I think it's probably related to the story of Aslan and how he says that he's in other worlds, we just don't see him. And it's every time I'm walking on the walls and I see a cat, I think maybe that's Aslan, maybe that's him. But I think God is at work amongst us in so many ways. And I do think we see him in beauty and in works of art. We see him in the lives of each other. Let's endeavor to see more of God and understand that we are spiritual beings. I think we can garner that from that God is sovereign. Okay, here's my next one. Life is authored. Now, it's a bit of a play on words here. The first is definitely this idea of God writing his story. So yeah, God the artist, if you like, God the creator, God the author of all the stories that make up the story of the world. He's writing your story today. And I found these amazing verses. So Jeremiah 10, verse 23 reminds me that my life is not my own. It says, Lord, this is Jeremiah speaking, Lord, I know that people's lives are not their own. It is not for them to direct their steps. Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 says, you are not your own. You were bought with a price. Psalm 138 verse 8 says, God, you will fulfill your purpose for me. I find this really helpful to understand that I belong to God, that he's writing my story. It takes the pressure off. It means we can relax again. That's what's amazing about God. We can sort of discover life like it should be. We can unburden ourselves and say, God, I trust in you. You're sovereign. You're the one who has got this in control. So I just give my life back to you. God, it's yours anyway. And I'm yours. I want to live for you. I want my whole life to be that living sacrifice of praise for your glory, Lord. Life is authored. But it's a play on words because I do want to remind us that sovereignty also speaks of God's authority. That he ultimately is the go-to for life. He is the one that should be the authority in our lives. It goes a bit against the grain of our, intelligent, Western, democratized selves, because we're our own boss, aren't we? We're our own God. We do what we want. But actually, there is a higher authority, and that's captured in the idea that God is sovereign. And because of that, you can go to him with all that you are and all that you need. Many of you would be aware that for quite a long time, at least 10 years, I worked in a political office, in a constituency office. I worked for Darren. And one of the things I loved about the job was people would come to us with their problems, and we were in a position to help them. That was brilliant. That just felt like the kingdom of God at work. And do you know how we help people most of the time? So if someone had an issue with a company, whereas I guess most of us in our day-to-day world would find the phone number for the customer helpline, and we'd begin our journey from the bottom, if you like, and slowly work our way up through the organization until we get to the point where our problems are addressed. Working with Darren and in that office, we would go straight to the top. We'd go straight to the authority in the organization. We'd go straight to the one, if you like, who was sovereign. And 9 times out of 10, the problems would get solved. It's a bit like that with life, really, with God. You can go straight to him. When you acknowledge him, that he is the author of your life, the authority in your life, it kind of gives you that ticket, if that's not too demeaning a way of describing it, of going straight to him, saying, God, I've got this to deal with. You're sovereign, so here you go. You can have this burden. And I'm going to cast it upon you because you care for me. Life is authored. Okay, and here's my final one, everyone. Life has meaning because God is sovereign. Because if, and I believe he is, God created everything, is in charge of everything, is looking after everything, it means that this isn't just a random, sequence of evolved events. It means that everything about us and the life we experience has meaning. I've got this, pensive philosopher here. And the verses I've used to describe this and help us understand this are quite philosophical. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 is all about to everything there is a season and a time. For that to be true, everything must have meaning. If everything has a season and a time. And I do love Ecclesiastes 5 verse 2. This really kind of puts it into context for me. It says, do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God, because God is in heaven and you are on earth. So let your words be few. I think the sovereignty of God causes us to think twice before jumping to conclusions. It causes us to think twice about thinking we know it all. It caused me to think twice about spouting off about things. Because life has meaning because God is sovereign. That's so important. So just to kind of wrap this all up, I want to just come back to that tension in all this about, okay, if God is sovereign, how come this is happening? And it's usually bad stuff. If God is in control, how come this is happening over here? If God is sovereign, well, do I really have any choice? What about human responsibility? They're really good questions. It's like there's two sides. We've got God and his divinity. We've got us, our humanity, and our responsibility. How do we find the meeting place? How do we bring those two together? Oh, this is great. God's divinity, our humanity, completely met in unity and harmony in the person of Jesus Christ. He was both human and God. So he brings both together in his life. And I think, look at his prayer life. You can tell a lot about people by their prayer lives. Not only did he tell us to pray in a certain way, our Father in heaven, let your will be done, etc. He then put that into practice himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he brought both together and said, not my will, but your will, yours be done. And the things that we do struggle with, perhaps if you like, acknowledging God as creator, as sovereign, wanting to hold on to all our pride and our autonomy, we can begin to undo some of that and make good steps forwards by praying this prayer about everything we do, the stuff we're hoping for, the stuff we're believing for, the stuff we're struggling with, the stuff we feel we have to do, the stuff we don't understand. I've found that adopting Jesus' stance, saying, oh God, I don't know if I get this or like this, but not my will, but yours be done. I found it helps us grapple with some of the questions that sometimes emerge around the sovereignty of God. So there we have it, everyone. We've looked at God is sovereign, a few definitions around that, some great verses, some stuff to think about. And my prayer for you is that you would grow in your knowledge of God and perhaps get a fresh glimpse of God's sovereignty. God bless everyone. Look forward to seeing you soon.